Should you believe in God? Is it more rational to believe in God or to be an atheist? And even if you wanted to believe in God, is belief something you can just choose? These are the kinds of questions raised directly and indirectly in a classic philosophical thought experiment known as Pascal's wager. The simple argument is this: we don't know if God exists, but you should believe in him anyway, because given the possibility of eternal torment if you don't, it's too risky not to. Now, I'll expand on this later, but first let's talk about the man behind this thought experiment. The French mathematician, physicist and philosopher Blaise Pascal, born today in 1623. See how I said mathematician, physicist and philosopher? Well, that's because Pascal is a classic example of the good old polymath that's so dear to my heart, what some people refer to as a Renaissance man. You know, the type of person who tries their hand at everything and is amazing at it. Pascal was a child prodigy, already a mathematical mastermind when he was just a kid. And among his accomplishments, he invented the first mechanical calculator aged 19 to help his father with his tax calculations. What have you done for your dad's tax returns? He pioneered the concepts of vacuum and pressure is still measured in Pascal units today. And his book Pensée is one of the most revered works in French literature. He also came up with the mathematical concept still known as Pascal's triangle, and today there's even a computing language named after him, so a pretty impressive guy. But his most important contribution, I'd say, to Western culture is the development of probability theory, which I'll discuss in a bit when we get to Pascal's wager. So yeah, really smart guy, and one after my own heart. But here's a little context. So Pascal is living in the age right after Descartes and Galileo have come along. Now those two had pretty much kick-started modern philosophy and modern science. See, since the earliest philosophers in ancient Greece, the so-called pre-Socratics, we're talking around 500 BC, science and philosophy were the same thing. It was all about figuring out the nature of the universe, and that's why Aristotle, for instance, the philosopher, also invented disciplines like biology, zoology, geology, and physics, which today we consider science. Aristotle, by the way, was considered the greatest philosopher and scientist who had ever lived, and that's because he had been adopted as ground zero by Christians and even Islamic scholars in medieval times. All of medieval scientific and philosophical literature is based on Aristotle. So for almost 2,000 years, Aristotle's ideas about the universe have been dogma in Western culture. But Descartes and Galileo change all this. They challenge Aristotle's view of an ordered, comprehensible universe. Descartes, of course, does this with his idea that, well, we don't know anything other than the fact that we have consciousness, you know. I think, therefore I am. That's the only thing Descartes says we genuinely know, because anything else can be an illusion. So Descartes shatters Aristotle's idea of a world that can be known. Suddenly we're in a world of skepticism where we know nothing except the fact that we personally exist. And Galileo did his own revolution by looking out at the universe through a telescope and saying, hang on a minute, everything you've told us about the planets and stars is bullshit. So when Pascal comes along, science and philosophy have had to start from scratch and are now what is known as modern science and modern philosophy. Pascal comes into all this, and he's among the first scientists in the modern sense, because he's not interested in figuring out the ultimate nature of the universe. He thinks, well, you know, all of this is a big mystery, so we can't know it. Instead, let's focus on what we can know, and that's science. That's using the scientific method, mathematics, hypotheses, and experiments to discover what's actually there. So that's pretty much what today we'd consider a typical scientist, right? Except Pascal is a bit more interesting than that. Because in his 20s, he had some kind of mystical religious experience. And we don't know the details of it, but we know that it was shocking, because whatever he saw, it left him profoundly shaken. And so much so that he converted to Christianity, specifically a bit of a crazy sect known as Jansenism. And for the rest of his short life, because he died in his 30s, Pascal focused exclusively on philosophy and the question of God. And this is where Pascal's wager comes in. Hey guys, it's Patrick, and again, apologies for the background noise, but I'm out and about in London in the middle of the street, and so you're going to have to make do with this. So we're talking about Blaise Pascal, the French philosopher who was born today in 1623. And if you want some background about him, just check out the last segment I posted earlier today. But now we're talking about the thing he's most famous for, Pascal's wager. A classic thought experiment which has been hotly debated for going on 400 years now, and it's easy to see why. Because in a way it addresses perhaps the most urgent and unanswered question mankind has ever asked. The question of the existence of God. It's a pretty big deal, right? But it's also interesting because it involves an early iteration of probability theory, which Pascal himself developed. Now, we all know how relevant probability theory is today. It's used in everything from gambling to insurance companies to asset management, etc., etc. Now, as I mentioned in the last segment, Pascal was a rigorous scientist who in his 20s had a mystical experience and converted to Christianity, specifically a super pessimistic version of Christianity known as Jansenism. The central idea in Jansenism is that salvation depends on God choosing to save you. Humans don't have any agency, we're just creatures of sin, deeply corrupt, and even our good actions are merely God choosing to act through us. So in other words, we just suck. And on top of this, Pascal is a scientist in the tradition of Descartes, so he's aware that we inhabit an unknowable, mysterious universe, where at the very best we can light up tiny corners of the universe through our reason. So basically we are wretched, miserable creatures living in a world of uncertainty. And Pascal compares it to spending life being chained in a dungeon, and every now and then a guard comes along and strangles somebody at random. Pretty cool, right? So how do we make sense of such an existence? Well, of course, he's a 17th century Christian, so obviously you know the answer is God, specifically Christianity. But here's the thing, he's a scientist too, so he can't just take God for granted. He knows you can't scientifically prove the existence of God, so how does he justify our turning to something whose existence he can't prove? And that's what Pascal's wager is. It's a very simple argument. There are two possible states of the world. Either God exists or he doesn't exist. If God doesn't exist and you believe in God, you've lost nothing. There are no consequences. Similarly, if God doesn't exist and you don't believe in him, you've also lost nothing. So basically, if God doesn't exist, whether you believe in him or not doesn't make a difference. But if God does exist and you do believe in him, then you gain eternity in paradise. And the flip side, of course, is that if God does exist and you don't believe in him, then you're punished with an eternity of torture and damnation. So given that, and given the sort of cost-benefit analysis of those facts, the most rational decision, according to Pascal, is to believe in God, because you lose nothing and potentially gain salvation, and you definitely avoid damnation. So that's easy peasy, right? This is at heart a probability calculus, so you can see why it's at the foundation of our modern decision theory. But let's discuss the merits of Pascal's wager. Having heard that, what do you make of it? Does it make sense to you? Do you see it as a solid argument, and why? Or do you think it has flaws? And if so, what do you think those are? I'd like you to let me know. I'll be sharing my own thoughts on Pascal's wager later on this evening. But until then, I'd love to hear your own thoughts on this, because I think it's a really good exercise. So let me know, and I'll catch you later with more of the Great Everything. I've been talking about Pascal's wager today, the weighing of probabilities and possible outcomes for believing versus not believing in God. If God doesn't exist, it doesn't make any difference whether you believe in him or not. But if God does exist, then whether you believe in him or not is the difference between eternal salvation and eternal damnation. So believe in God, dummy. Why wouldn't you? So on the face of it, it's a pretty solid argument, right? The cost-benefit analysis seems to work. And in general, I'm also quite tickled by how Pascal kind of demonstrates that believing in God is the most rational choice you could make. You know, whereas today atheists present themselves as the bastions of rationality. So it's a little reversal that I find quite amusing. But let's get serious, because there's actual flaws in the argument. Being rigorous, first of all, Pascal says that by believing in God, you don't lose anything. Is that really true, though? Because we assume that he's talking about a hardcore Protestant God, the 17th century version. So believing in God isn't just a matter of believing certain facts about the universe. God created the world in 6 days. It entails certain acts and behaviors. What I'm saying is that in the case in which you're accepting God, you're giving up something. Like, for instance, a world of bodily pleasures and other things that Christians might consider a sin. And that should be weighed up. It's not accurate to say you lose nothing by believing in God. And that's something that affects the probability calculus, right? Pascal also says there's two possible state of affairs. Either God exists or he doesn't. But what about a third state of affairs? For instance, God does exist, but he doesn't care whether you believe in him or not. Or God exists, but it's an impersonal God with whom it's impossible to enter into a direct relationship. So we found additional scenarios that change the probability calculation. These are all factors that point towards not believing. Another problem with the wager is that Pascal is talking about the Christian God. But what about other religions? Which God should I actually believe in? So my friend Seb, he heard the show earlier here on Anchor, and he sent me a funny little cartoon about Pascal's wager. And it's this little guy who's all pumped about taking the wager and accepting God, because what's he got to lose? Except, of course, he then dies and goes to heaven, and he finds the Hindu god Ganesh lying on a cloud going, "What's up, fool?" But it's a good point, right? What if you end up backing the wrong god? I mean, I guess you could say, if you have, say, 1,000,000 gods to choose from, and you pick one at random, you still got more of a chance of saving yourself from damnation than if you choose atheism, right? It's a bit like the difference between buying a lottery ticket or not buying a lottery ticket. At least in the first case, you have some chance of hitting the jackpot. But of course, the main objection, and the one which I find most compelling, is how do you choose to believe something? If you don't believe in God, is it possible to just flip a switch and believe? It's like, have you ever been in the situation where you're going out with someone who's really into you and you like them, but you don't love them? And you really wish you could love them because on paper they're perfect, but as much as you want to and you try, it's just not something you decide, right, to fall in love. Faith, I think, is like that. Either you have faith or you don't. So you could say maybe the wager works with religions like Judaism, where the rituals and the behaviors are kind of as important, maybe even more important than the belief. But most religions are about what you believe, not how you act. And in all those cases, choosing to believe is just something that doesn't work. So that's just a few objections to Pascal's wager. Clearly it's not a great tool to be used in a debate between atheists and skeptics. And believers, really, that's more important. But the way Pascal calculated probabilities is pretty clever and can really help with our decision making. You could say, removing God from it from a moment, that under conditions of uncertainty, a good way to make a decision is by multiplying the odds that something will happen by the value of it happening. So if nothing else, Pascal gave us that. It's not nothing.